Good evening and welcome to this special ANZAC Day edition of The Nation. We are coming to you from within the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, in the ANZAC Hall no less. And we've brought together a range of different perspectives tonight to look at ANZAC Day, why it holds such a special place for Australians. The director of the Australian War Memorial, Brendan Nelson, also a former Defence Minister during the Howard government. Major General Jim Molan is a retired Army officer who served in Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, East Timor and in Iraq as the Chief of Operations for the multinational force there. Peter Fitzsimons is a journalist and author who has brought to life some of Australia's most significant military achievements in his books Kokoda and Tobruk. And Major Matina Jewell is a former Army officer and peacekeeper, an ambassador of Australian peacekeepers and a member of the ANZAC Centenary Commission. Welcome to you all. I want to start with the simple question. Why is ANZAC Day so special to Australians? I mean, other countries do honour and revere their military members, their war history. But here in Australia, this has really become the day, hasn't it? More so than Australia Day, I would argue, of national significance. Jim Molan, perhaps you could start with your thoughts on why ANZAC Day is what it is.
David, I think it's got something to do with the fact that you never stop building a nation. And I've served in lots of countries which are coming from not much and trying to build into modern nations, but modern countries like Australia still must build. And we have a military history that you can't jump over. And it's essential that each and every generation comes to terms with that military history. And it's not being militarist or anything like that to come to terms with what our predecessors have done in Australia. I think it's got something to do with that. I can't fully explain the fascination of young Australians now for ANZAC Day and for going to Gallipoli. But you wouldn't knock it.
Well, no, and we'll explore that. But Peter Fitzsimons, what do you think? We're not a warlike nation, and we are a long way from some of the global hotspots. Why do we get into ANZAC Day so much?
I agree with Jim to begin with that our military record, is a very honourable one. That we don't have a My Lai, for example, on our record. We don't have atrocities. But I think that First World War, 4.5 million people, and we lost 60,000 dead. 60,000 dead.
Which on a population number at the time was
exactly.
a big
and
number.
It was such a thing that it's in our DNA, so that every town, every community lost 1, 2, 3, families wiped out, and that I heard the stories from my father and I tell them to my children, and it's in us somehow. And I think that when you go to Gallipoli, the first time I went there I was a footballer playing rugby in Italy, and I got there in 1984, and my strong feeling was that I'm on sacred Australian soil overseas somehow. That it's somehow, it's DNA somehow, and it's hard to define it, but it's there.
Matina, you've served with officers from other countries. And as I say, other countries do respect and honour their military history and their military members. Is it something different in Australia, really?
Yeah, I think it is something really quite different and unique to Australians, and certainly trying to explain to my United Nations colleagues that in Australia we actually commemorate one of our biggest losses of Gallipoli. And trying to explain that to some of the Chinese and Russian peacekeepers that I was serving with, it was a very foreign concept, and I guess that's kind of almost unique to our Australian character, in a sense that we really pause and reflect and commemorate the loss of so many lives on one of our biggest operations overseas in World War I.
May I just add to that? It is. You mentioned Kokoda and Tobruk. It is staggering that in the Second World War, our forces were the first to stop. So the Germans, 5th of September 39, into Poland and on and down and through, and they go all the way through Europe and they get to North Africa. First time they stopped, the Australians stopped them just outside of Tobruk and then hold them off. So that was the first reverse for the German land army. Japan, 7th of December 41, bombing Pearl Harbor, Philippines, and on and on and on. First time they stopped, the Australians stopped them at not Kokoda, but Milne Bay. Milne Bay. So on our record is Australians were the first to stop the Germans and the Japanese, seriously aggressive nations doing the wrong thing. And yet it is odd that we say, yeah, but did we tell you about the time we invaded peaceful Turkey?
And we suffered some losses.
And we lost 9,000 of our men?
Yeah, but Brendan Nelson, tell us, and it's not all about Gallipoli, ANZAC Day, but why is this battle in particular so important to Australia historically?
Well, it's interesting. I think it's who we are. As we've just heard from these three, and there are 23 million Australians now, and you'll get 23 million different opinions about what it all means.
11,
and 11, yeah. But it's who we are. We're a people, we haven't been invaded. We're not natural aggressors. We have an extreme distaste for war. We're relentlessly in pursuit of peace and sending peacekeepers throughout the world to make and enforce peace. But essentially, we are also people who've inherited a spiritual legacy from the Gallipoli landing right through to what we see in Afghanistan today, of courage, endurance, the concept of selfless determination to help one another. And of all of the stories out of the First World War, part myth and part truth, the Simpson and his donkey, the idea of a guy basically putting himself in harm's way at risk of losing his own life to help his mates, essentially. It's that kind of ethos, and I think I'm 54. I think I'm the member of the last generation of Australians that was given a pre-packaged set of values: God, King and country. This is the way your life's going to be. Young people today are increasingly finding their sense of belonging and meaning in being an Australian in our military history. Not in the fighting, but rather in the values that we found and saw in most, not all, of those men and women who've gone in our name.
But Jim Molan, this day hasn't always had the place in our national psyche that it perhaps has today. When did ANZAC Day become what it is? Because presumably after World War I, and perhaps even immediately after World War II, it wasn't what it was today.
No, it wasn't, but there was an extraordinary series of events in the 20s as the soldiers who only a few years ago were fighting and bleeding on the Western Front. ANZAC Day was used for sectarian reasons. There's a great photograph of Archbishop Mannix with all the Catholic Victoria Cross winners leading a march in Melbourne, and it was done obviously for sectarian reasons at that stage. But it's gone up and down. I think in our memory, where it's gone down may have been during the Vietnam War, where so much was taken out on the participants because of the Vietnam War, and therefore I think it went down then. And we see this in America as well. There seems to be a guilt associated with this, which may be causing us to overcompensate to a certain degree, and you see that on the streets in the US every day you're over there.
I would say it started to resuscitate, basically in the John Howard years. I remember 96, 97.
Maybe East Timor, Peter.
Maybe, but I remember suddenly thinking out of the blue, I think I'll take my kids to ANZAC Day. Got them up before dawn and we went. And I think we were expecting maybe 10,000 people. There were 50,000, in the sense that there was a sudden surge. And I don't know if John Howard fiddled with our head or not.
What about you specifically, Peter? I mean, you have taken that interest to a whole other level with the books that you've written, but what sparked it for you?
Well, one thing, I wrote a book on Nancy Wake, the White Mouse, the most decorated heroine of the Second World War, and honestly, I thought it would sell, and the publishers thought it would sell 5,000 or 10,000, and it sold 200,000. And that there was a sudden surge of interest in, partly, she was a female war hero, so there were so many sort of males that were celebrated, and not so many females. But I, like most Australians, before I started writing the book on Kokoda and Tobruk, Kokoda, New Guinea, I think we did pretty well. You get into it, it's a fantastic story, it's unbelievable.
And it now has become such a destination, along with Gallipoli, for young Australians and older Australians to go and trek. I've done it myself. It's one of the, after reading your book.
It's good on you.
I think Jim and Peter are making a very important point. We went through, in that Vietnam era, there was ANZAC Day was falsely portrayed as some sort of celebration of war, which of course it isn't. But also the individual stories. People relate, as we all know, to individual stories. Peter has played a significant role in bringing that to life. So when we talk about 62,000 dead from the First World War, from a population of 4.5 million, okay, that has impact. But when someone is telling the story of a certain private or corporal or whoever it is in a particular battle and losing his life and the impacts on families back at home, that brings it to life. And young people relate to that.
I think I can totally agree with what Brendan's saying in that capacity, that I think the older generations from World War I and II were reluctant to talk about their experiences and didn't share. From my own experience, my grandfather served in World War II, and he very rarely spoke about his experiences. And I would have loved, as then a serving member and now as a veteran, to have been able to sit down with him and to hear him tell those stories.
Both my parents.
I think that has changed in current and younger generations.
Is that simply because the wounds were still so
very
real?
raw to him, yeah. And I think, like many of those that era, they really carried the wounds of war and battle.
And why was that? Why was that different?
That.
Because you I might get you to explain your experiences, because you've been through some shocking stuff as well.
Yeah, I guess I had a fortunate career in the military. I served for 15 years, and during that time I served on 5 overseas missions. And it was the last mission that I was serving in the Middle East, this time in Syria and then in Lebanon, with the United Nations as a peacekeeper. And unfortunately that mission actually ended my military career, as I was right on the border between Israel and Lebanon during the 2006 Israel-Lebanon war. And during that war, after so many near misses at my base, at Patrol Base Kiyam, which was right at the junction of those 3 countries of Israel, Lebanon and Syria, after so many near misses there from all types of weaponry, from fighter jets and attack helicopters, tanks and artillery fire, and you got to remember we were an unarmed peacekeeping force. We're there to monitor a peace agreement. But within a second, that all changed and went from monitoring peace to being in the thick of full-scale war around us.
And it was an Israeli airstrike in the end that hit the base where you were?
Yeah, so I was very fortunate that I had been sent off to command an armoured vehicle convoy through the war. Fortunately, I was injured during that convoy and broke 5 vertebrae in my back, which ended my military career. But just a couple of days later, the base that I'd been at was bombed by an Israeli fighter jet, a 1,000-pound bomb, direct hit on the bunker, which tragically killed all of my teammates at the base.
See, you're able to talk about this, I don't know how comfortably, but you're able to talk about this. And we're just making that point about the generation prior really struggling to do so.
I think
is that something that you consciously think about and push yourself to explain your experience?
For me, it was actually a cathartic process in sharing my experiences, and I was very driven to ensure that there were positive lessons learnt from my experiences to change and save lives of others. So that was the driving force behind me sharing my story. But I think also I now sit on the National Mental Health Forum. I think it's actually a healthy environment if you can share those experiences of such horrific situations that anyone who has experienced war firsthand knows how bloody and horrific that situation on the battlefield is.
And we should give a rap for where we are, the War Memorial. I mean, you guys do an amazing job in recording and telling those stories as well, and that's now a very important process.
Well, they're extremely important, and part of what happened in earlier generations, the veterans who returned felt guilty about surviving and living when they saw so many killed, and not to mention the other horrors of the impact of the war. But also for the Australian War Memorial, listening to Matina, it reinforces the importance of the memorial telling the stories, telling them soon. Not as we did after Vietnam, reflecting society and waiting a period of time before telling the story of the Vietnam experience. We need to tell the story now. We'll be telling Afghanistan this year. We also need to put as much emphasis on peacekeeping, and anyone who recently I've had to deal with people trivialising the role of peacekeeping as if it's something that's fairly innocuous and harmless.
That issue,
just listen to what we've just heard. Would you rather be in that situation or be fully armed in a bushmaster somewhere? So part of the memorial's responsibility, in my view, is not just to educate and inform Australians and prompt them to reflect. It has a therapeutic role on these veterans. They need to know that they can come here, that they can see, read, hear and feel something about what they've done.
And could I just add to that? I think it's all very well to say, lest we forget, but we have to provide the means to remember. And so that when you come in here and you see this is where you get some aspect of what it would have been like.
Absolutely, and you go to the Vietnam gallery, and it's hard not to feel like you're right there.
But you see, and I say, David, and this is part of our messaging for ANZAC Day, has been to reach out to veterans of contemporary conflicts, because what I've observed as a non-military person is that the veterans of Solomon Islands, East Timor, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Rwanda, they quietly go to the dawn service, but very few participating in marches, which is why we had Ben Roberts-Smith come here and march to say to young veterans, this is for you no less than it is for veterans of early conflicts.
That brings us to the issue of who marches and who should march and who shouldn't march. This is annually a debate about whether families should march, should they march at the back of the pack, next to their family member who served. Should it be broadened out to other fields like volunteer bushfire fighters and lifesavers. Jim Molan, what do you think? Who should march on ANZAC Day?
I think you've got to limit it to the veterans. The veterans must get priority. This is where it came from, and there are plenty of veterans around. I saw the figures today of the number that have served in Afghanistan, and they've slipped my mind entirely, but it's a big number.
25,000.
That's it. A very impressive number. So we will have veterans. If we can encourage them to participate in the marches, we won't be short of people to commemorate ANZAC Day.
But should there be, if my grandfather served in PNG, he's no longer here, should I be able to march?
No.
On his behalf?
I don't think so. I'd agree with Peter. If you've got to compromise, there are ways of compromising that. And I'm a great compromiser. But I would like to start the argument by saying this is a day for veterans, and the families of veterans stand on the side and applaud what they've done.
I grew up as a little boy. Both my parents served in the Second World War, and we would go to Sydney and they would march down George Street, and there was my dad and there was my mum, and we'd wave, and it would never occur to me 20 years, 30 years, 40 years later for me to march with those few remaining, because I didn't serve. And it is wonderful somehow when you see grandkids proudly marching, and you want that, but it loses the focus really of those who served.
Matina, do you march on ANZAC Day?
Yes, I do, and I guess while serving, I think it should be encouraged that serving members march on ANZAC Day, and as many as possible. I think part of the issue is that serving members actually see themselves not as veterans actually until they retire from the Defence Force.
You're not old enough to be a veteran.
I get told that every ANZAC Day, Peter.
And how do you feel
I'm wearing my father's medals on the wrong side.
How do you feel about family members taking part?
Well, look, I really encourage anyone who wishes to participate in ANZAC Days to be involved in the capacities that they would like to participate. So I'd hate to see stifling of people being involved within the ceremonies, but I think I agree with Jim and Peter and that on this issue that veterans need to be the priority on these marches, particularly in the city services where the marches, there's so many veterans marching that literally to get through the veterans and current serving members, you're hours into a parade before family members can join in anyway. So if it has to be sort of a negotiation, potentially in small communities and rural areas where there is an option for family members to be involved, But I believe personally that for the big parades it should be just the veterans and serving members.
Now, in a couple of years' time, of course, comes the centenary of the Gallipoli landing, and this will be a huge national moment, and much of the activity will be happening on the Gallipoli Peninsula. The fact is, not everyone who wants to go can go to this, but critics say the government should not stop people who want to go, and particularly those who've already prepaid to go, being able to attend. Peter?
It's a simple public safety issue. You cannot, it can bear about 10,000 people. In the main site, you cannot have 25,000 or 30,000 people there. You therefore have to have a means of fairly limiting it. What is fairer than a ballot? So it's absolutely luck. It's not who's wealthy, who's poor, who's whatever. You just say we'll have a ballot and we'll choose 8,000 Australians and 2,000 Kiwis to be there, and it will be sad for those who really want to be there who'll miss out. But what better way?
And as you would know from going there and seeing it, it's a very fragile
I was there last month, and when you go, for example, to, for me, the most moving place is where the Battle of the Neck took place on the 7th of August. And it's always described as a tennis court. It's actually half a football field. But you can't have 10,000 people there. You could have 200 or 300 in safety, but you've got trenches, like the original trenches there. You've got the Lone Pine cemeteries just over there. You can't have people sleeping out among that. It's got to be under some control. And you imagine if the Japanese had invaded, let's just say, in 1942, and hit Bondi Beach and left 10,000 soldiers behind. Would we have 100,000 Japanese crowding onto Bondi Beach? I mean, the Turks have got some say in it too. And this is, as you say, it's a fragile environment. It's a sacred environment. It's not for a rock concert.
Brendan Nelson, do you think this is... you can understand that the argument there, but will people accept that?
I think they do. Look, we're Australians, and on ANZAC Day we've been reflecting on what it all means and what it means to be an Australian, and we get it. In fact, around the RSL clubs and other places today, they've all been playing two up and the like. We get the idea of odds and having a ballot.
I think Tom Waterhouse was there, wasn't he?
Let's not go there.
But there's something else too. Look, I was privileged. John Howard asked me when I was Defence Minister to go to Gallipoli in 2007. I spent a week writing 3 speeches, 6 minutes each. And I said to John Howard when I got back, whatever happens to me in my future life, nothing will exceed the experience in honour of that. But to be perfectly frank with you, the best time to go to Gallipoli is not Anzac Day. It's to wander around those cemeteries, read the epitaphs, look at the headstones, reflect on the landscape, where the guys came from. 6 months before they got there, they were butchers, bakers, shop assistants and the like. And as far as the ballot goes, the one thing that's really, it's a family show, so I better keep my language straight, but one thing that's really annoyed me recently, these people that have prepaid, pre-sold these tours and all this sort of stuff, they are saying, oh, it's un-Australian for the government and bureaucrats to decide who's going to go. In my view, whatever the ANZAC legacy means to any of us, it's not about saying, oh, well, if you've paid your money and you've bought a ticket and someone's, sort of turning something out of it, that you're going to get priority over somebody else. I think Peter's absolutely right. We understand the idea of a ballot. There's a limit to how many people you can put in there, and this is the way to go.
And as you say, you do on the centenary of Lone Pine, you do on the centenary of the Battle of the Neck, you do it on the centenary of the evacuation. I mean, there are so
everyone can get or more people can get a chance. But Jim Molan, do you worry this whole centenary thing could turn into a bit of a circus over there?
As long as they control it from our end, I don't think it will. We've seen tendencies towards a rock concert attitude in the past, and but that seems to have gone away last year from what I could see on TV. I don't know whether you were there, but there's an awful lot of war to come. This is not just the centenary of ANZAC and Gallipoli. This is the centenary of Hamel and some extraordinary battles.
And may I raise one point? Peter Broun, who's a terrific writer from Adelaide, who wrote Ragged Bloody Heroes, among others, I can't do justice to the eloquence of his remarks in his foreword, but he made the point, and it's a really significant one, that it's so arbitrary that if you died at Gallipoli or you died at Fromelles or you died at Kokoda or Tobruk, you're revered because you died in a famous battle. His point was there are so many diggers lying forgotten in a lost ditch somewhere who are every bit as brave, who gave their lives
just as much
and deserve every bit as much reverence as those who happened to die on the beach on the 25th of April 1915.
We've got to take a break. We're then going to stay with us, we're going to look at the nature of warfare, how it's changed over our military history. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're coming to you from the Australian War Memorial this Anzac Day, and we're talking to the former Defence Minister in the Howard Government, now Director of the Australian War Memorial, Brendan Nelson. Major General Jim Molan is a retired Army officer who served as Chief of Operations for the multinational force in Iraq. Peter Fitzsimons, journalist and author of books such as Kokoda and Tobruk, also a member of the War Memorial Council. And Major Matina Jewell, former Army officer and peacekeeper and an ambassador of Australian peacekeepers. And we are here in the ANZAC Hall of the Australian War Memorial. It's a privilege to be here and to be discussing some of these issues this Anzac Day. I want to turn to the very nature of warfare, because as you can see from the exhibitions, not just in this hall but around the War Memorial, the nature of warfare has changed dramatically since the days of the Light Horse Brigade through to the sort of drone attacks that we see in modern warfare today. Jim Molan, has that meant a different type of person has been required in the Australian military, or is it still, regardless of technology, whether you're on horseback or in a fighter jet, it's the same type of Australian that is used and is useful in war?
I think there is an Australian characteristic which means that our ability to produce soldiers, is sailors, airmen and women, is quite extraordinary and quite unique. And that is a lack of respect for authority. There is a questioning of authority, and a relaxed attitude towards discipline in things that aren't important.
And is that good?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. In modern warfare, the last thing you want is someone who unquestioningly obeys every order. The only order I have unquestioningly obeyed all my life is duck. And I'm prepared to go that far, but what we should respect is soldiers who say, listen boss, we've done that 3 times, it hasn't worked on those occasions, why are we doing it again? And we produce that, and you see a lot of countries in the world, Western societies, US, UK, Australia, produce it much better than many other societies throughout the world, and it really is the strength of our society, I think.
It's funny, when I was Defence Minister, people would often say
We did
to
what
me,
you said, I think.
Yes, very obedient, Jim, mostly. But when I was Defence Minister, people would often say to me, we've been lucky, Australians have been lucky, and I'd say, yeah, of course, we have had some luck, but it's much more than that. I've found the quality of the leadership at all levels was stunningly impressive. The equipment, notwithstanding the odd gripes we get, the equipment that's provided to our troops is excellent. The quality of the training is extensive and it's deep, but there's something about the Australian character. And I noticed these young diggers, 20 years of age, they would see themselves